I'm still. Sorry, it's like really, I must be overworking my computer in some way. All right, so as always, if you have any comments, questions, anything, please pop in here because I am going to minimize everyone so I can see what I'm looking at. So as I said, what we do as therapists, what we do as human beings is inherently political. We are affected by policies. We are affected by power. So one of the tagline of the feminist approach and multicultural feminist approach is the personal is political. So I did try to do a little bit of research on the origins of this, but really, so Carol Hanisch was popularized this in an essay that she wrote, but she had said that she had heard it or seen it someplace else. But so this was started in 1970 was the kind of branding of the personal is the political being the tagline of the feminist critique. So why do we need feminism? Why do we need multicultural critiques? So basically, psychopathology continues to be something that we struggle with. And a lot of the approaches, as we know, so this is one of the contributions that marriage and family therapy made, is pulling the etiology off of the individual, or the explanation of what is going on off of the individual, and at some points stopping at the family. And what feminist and multicultural critiques say is, whoa, we got to go more macro than this. There's a lot of stuff that can be contributing to the concerns and the struggles that we are seeing. So we also know that we are in a field that is, it's a business, and it can perpetuate the same values and aspirations that create the need for therapy. So our field isn't liberated of these constraints. Our field isn't liberated from the continuing with the status quo. And that comes from our origins, and that comes from the structure of society in many ways. So really, the feminist and multicultural critiques say we've got to do a better job of essentially decolonizing, bringing in anti-racist, anti-sexist. We want to help be a part of the dismantling of the systems that create oppression and that limit people in their access and their abilities to be who they want to be embraced for who they want to be, have a solid sense of identity, that these are outside of the individual, and that society is a culprit in the exacerbation and perpetuation of some of the issues that we are seeing in therapy. It's never separate. So what feminist and multicultural critics say about the field is that we as therapists lack a wider theoretical perspective of what might be happening. So again, in certain fields, it's specific to the individual. In our field, it can really, in many of the theories that we have studied, the societal impact or the influence is overlooked or completely missed in it. So even though it makes little sense to foster an adjustment to these, so it's like, well, yeah, society, cultural, economic systems, maybe we just need to adjust to them. That sounds ridiculous in a way of why don't we work to change the systems? But sometimes what we do as a field is we just promote this idea of the systems exist, which it's a reality, right? So what feminist and multicultural critics say is this is a limited view, that in terms of our morals and our ethics as humans, that, and particularly as our role in the therapy as a therapist, we should be working to not just say, it is what it is. Let's work to try to help people function as best as they can in this. That's a component of it, because change doesn't happen overnight. But one of the things that we want to promote in this approach is activism, is advocacy, is social justice. So it's taking that next step into being active about that, not only in the room, but outside of the therapy room. Psychotherapy is not designed as it currently stands to deal with social and cultural pathology. So how the dominant discourse affects different individuals in different communities. And finally, with the issue of why we need these critiques and why they are very, very relevant and useful, is that many times students graduate from programs, and we'll talk about this in terms of the limitations of your education as well, because as educators, we are in an institution that very much can lack the giving you the tools and even having the tools ourselves to deal with some of these more systemic, larger macro issues. So many programs that students enter don't teach you how to fully grasp the role of how class, gender, race, culture, all of these factors and how they intersect can contribute to issues. And it's not really, and if it is, it may be a component that is not given the weight that it deserves. So as therapists, historically, what can happen, and again, this isn't, well, we can talk about this. I want to be reflective about this. I don't want to talk at you about this. But that when the world is hurting, when it's struggling, when clear systematic oppression and clear isms are upheld by policies, by politics, many times therapists don't speak up about it. This can be due to many things. I'm thinking of, which, I mean, if I'm being transparent, I think it's a cop-out, but, I'm thinking of maybe some therapists who are in private practice and who want to, be as appealing to as many potential clients as possible. So they enter more of a business mindset. And I don't know that is a clear choice that is made. I don't know if that's mutually exclusive, right? Do you have to choose between a business identity and a personal political identity? So I'm just thinking out loud as I'm going through some of this stuff. So when the world is messed up, when clients come to see us, it is very important that in our role, specifically as a therapist, that we broach these topics. And we'll have some conversation about that a little bit later too. And so we have to be willing to discuss whatever issues may be contributing to the presenting issue, and be willing to talk about that beyond the individual, beyond the family, and those forces that are influencing the individual. So one of the things within feminist and multicultural perspectives is that we are understanding any of the injustices that are contributing or happening within our client's predicament, and then reflect on the question of the client's own agency in that, and then how we are also affected by that, so we'll talk about the concept of transcultural competence, and I'll further define that and have us talk about it. But then also having the client take whatever action they see is fit. I mean, of course, within the parameters of legality and stuff like that. But as we know, feminist and multicultural approaches are very collaborative, and really work to de-expert the therapist, in recognizing that it is a very, we bring a specific expertise, we bring a specific knowledge that we absolutely can't replicate that the client brings. So really at the center of both of these approaches is social justice, and becoming a social justice oriented therapist and having your therapy be social justice oriented. So hopefully this is a cornerstone of one of the things that we teach at Alliant, is having, so you can see all of the aspects of this: teaching, therapy, research, some of the areas that you are stepping into, and all of the areas that we provide as an institution. So we're asking these questions about gender socialization, class, acculturation, drug abuse, child abuse, technology related problems, and how that affects the individual, and how can we make change in those areas through dismantling oppressive systems and stuff like that. How do we go about doing that? And I just wanted to show you this this article. So, and we'll talk a little bit about this as well. Sorry. Okay. This is the article that is linked because, I know that we've talked about this in this class, and I'm sure you've probably heard it in other classes of, that being critical of, for example, evidence-based practices, right? Asking who created them, what does that person represent? What is their social position? What are the intersection of their identities? What's their power? What's their privilege? All of that kind of stuff. And then who are they studying? Like, who makes up the evidence? So this starts with, or this is contributed by the type of research that we do. And this is likely not a news flash to anybody, but just thinking of the areas that are informed, the areas that inform our therapy, the research that we do, it's clinical, the way that we teach. These are all areas that are subject to colonization, subject to patriarchy, subject to white supremacy, and informed by that. So part of the call in this is to make sure that we're critically looking at every aspect of how we gain knowledge, how we conduct our research, who are we hearing from, how are we informed. So I just wanted to share this with you, and it's a pretty short read if you're interested in looking into that. So we'll talk about we'll discuss the differences of this, but what I'm going to stop my share really quick and ask all of you a question. So what is your understanding of the difference between multicultural competence and transcultural competence? Go ahead, Juliana.
My understanding of multicultural is that many cultures are partaking in this space. Many cultures. There's not just one culture. It could be Latinx, it could be Eastern European, it could be Buddhism, it could be all cultures, and that's the multicultural. And then the transcultural, as I understanding, is what has come from, it could be the same culture, but how has it transpired and how has it modified itself based on social norms, social need, compliance, propaganda, conformity, all of that. That's how I understand it.
Anybody else have other? Caitlin, did I see you raise your hand?
Yeah, and then I put it down.
Once it's up, it's up.
I know.
A card played is a card played here.
I can't Uno reverse this.
That's okay if you don't want. I just didn't know if I can pitch it to Moni or Marcy.
Yeah, yeah. Well, okay. I talk enough.
Sure. Moni.
I was actually going to go out on a limb and be super vulnerable when I am going to say I haven't heard the word, I haven't heard of transcultural competence.
Great.
I've heard multicultural competence, but I'm going to be completely honest, and I don't know what that is, and I would love to know more, because I'm like, that sounds interesting, but what is it?
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Moni. I'm glad that this can be a space to learn something new. Marcy.
I'm not sure that this is the right answer, but when I hear transcultural, I think of intersectionality, you know, Kimberly Crenshaw and all of that. You know, if you're talking about somebody in one aspect of their culture, of their gender, of their sexual orientation, whatever it is, whatever marginalized identity they may be facing, thinking of it in terms of the other marginalized identities they may be also experiencing would be my conception of the trans part of that. But please correct me if I'm wrong.
Sure. So go ahead, Brianna. I love this. Great. Cool.
Yeah, I was going to go out on a limb too and say that I think multicultural competence is the competence in individual cultures, a magnitude of them, and
Sure.
transcultural competence might be what it looks like across different cultures. Does
Sure.
that make sense? Like how, kind of like Marcy was saying, the intersectionality of it, and how
Yeah.
they all kind of meet together. I don't know.
Yeah. No, this is great. So the definition that y'all are giving of transculturalism still is under the umbrella of multiculturalism. So the transculturalism is under, so this is where some self of the therapist comes in, is the meeting of cultures. So my culture and having understanding of what informs me, what are my biases, what are my stereotypes, what are my known traditions, what are my values, things like that. And when I'm sitting across from a human being or human beings, having an understanding of what their culture is and understanding how those two interplay with one another. So being very aware of how I'm informed when meeting a completely, not even necessarily completely, but different components, different aspects of another person's culture. So I'm just thinking, for example, if you look at me, I'm a, 30 something white, educated, straight passing, all of these things, that even if there's one aspect of another person who is another white woman who meets me, that there's some difference in terms of culture there. And I am aware of where there's similarities and differences and how those two, how I'm informed by that and how I conceptualial that. How do I work with that? Does that make sense? So multiculturalism is, and actually I'm going to have Dr. Sue give us some more information about that. So I'll let one of the experts in the field talk about that. Yeah, trans is the meeting of two. Yeah, Laura.
I was thinking, sorry, I always have the microphone somewhere except where it's supposed to be. I was thinking about how a lot of these there is a bias and an assumption as you were describing your appearance. I have a daughter who is blonde because her father is white, and she's heard like terrible things about Hispanics while she's standing up there thinking that she's white. So a lot of these comes with a lot of our own preconceived ideas of what the person in front of us looks like.
Absolutely.
Without, so I think of the first term, I'm like Moni, in my times, the first term was very familiar, the second one not. And what comes to mind is always just coming from the perspective of curiosity and not the expert, because as it is, every family is a subdivision of their own culture.
Absolutely.
You have a father, a mother, or two mothers, or like the combination, however it is. So
Right.
It's always coming with the perspective of being curious about their experience.
Absolutely. And even, each individual within that family has different identities that inform, their worldview, how they're received and perceived by the world. Yeah. So thank you so much for that, Laura. So does that distinction, is that helpful? so again, I'm going to give you a much better definition of multicultural competence in just a little bit, but I just want to be very clear about the understanding of yourself and how everything that you bring into that therapeutic relationship is understood by you and how it is received. Because I'm even thinking, Laura, in your example of like, how I might present differently, so we talk about different aspects of our identity and when they show up in different relationships. That's another one of the cornerstones of the feminist approach, is our identity in relation to others and how we show pieces of our identity differently depending upon our setting and stuff like that, where I have to be aware of, do I conduct myself differently with family A and family B? And if I do, why do I do that? What's going on? So that's some of that. That would be an example of transcultural competence, in the willingness to examine that and unpack that. So thanks, Jocelyn. Good, I'm glad. All right. Where are we? I never know where we are. Here we go. So this, when I alluded to this a little bit earlier, of that social ethics mentality of like knowing that there are injustices and there are systems that disproportionately negatively affect different individuals for their social position, and looking at that and saying, like, what can I do about that? Recognizing that you can't be everything all the time, but that there should be some advocacy and activism built in to, and the willingness to not stay neutral. And because you'll see in the last slide, another one of the important, mindsets of somebody who is a feminist and multiculturally informed, but being willing to say, I'm going to use, some of my privilege in a way that is helpful. And like, what do we do about these systems? What can I do as an individual, recognizing that maybe I'm not going to be the writer of policy, but can I influence it in some way? So looking at these ethics, these moral ethics, and saying, this is not okay. The way that the system functions isn't okay. What can I do about it? In a way that feels meaningful. But we're really taking an oath in that of being feminist informed, being multiculturally informed to actually do something outside of the therapy space. So some assumptions of human nature from a feminist lens is that we exist in political and social systems that are male dominated. This is the patriarchy. And in order for, we're talking about gender specifically here. So in order for women to experience change in their personal life, political changes need to occur. The personal is political, and that gender schemas and sex role stereotypes limit the development of people. More so, women are affected by this. So in society, men have more power than women. Women are taught to rely on men. This is still the dominant discourse, even with some of the progress that has been made. So again, it's just some foundational assumptions that inform feminism. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about just some of the more like what happens in the room when we are being feminist and multiculturally informed. And really, multiculturalism is what I would consider like a further evolution of feminism, right? So feminism is looking at equality, equity. It's very focused on gender, more so focused on women's issues, where multicultural, it kind of is like following the waves of feminism of saying, wait a minute, like how feminism started was very white informed and very exclusionary. There are still TERFs that run around here and think that they're like, doing good. So anyway, with multiculturalism, it's really saying, wait a minute, there are multiple aspects and there's intersections of identity that have to be considered here. The female experience is not homogenous. The dominant voice, even within the first two waves of feminism, were heavily white. I would argue it still is. So I just want to like I want to make note of how they're like building on one another. One's not necessarily better than one another, but I do think that if you're going to lean somewhere, leaning multiculturally and being feminist informed are important. Like the integration of these two are so important. So feminism brought what's the growth fostering relationship. So one of the differences, or I would say one of the differences, maybe one of the additional components, is this really the idea that the therapist is not unaffected in the room, that by virtue of working with individuals, that this should be a process as well where the therapist grows, that they are challenged, that they are, and this is informed by a lot of things. We'll talk about things like authenticity, but it is using this therapeutic relationship as a model or a platform for fostering connection in other relationships. Because within the feminist approach, some of the major thought behind why people struggle is a sense of disconnection. So how do we foster more connection? How can the therapist be a vehicle in that? And how can we use our humanity and our authenticity and our vulnerability as therapists within parameters to help build a sense of connection that can be replicated, or at least used to inform connection in relationships outside of the room. The feminist approach also contributed what's considered the 5 good things. And so what informs this growth fostering relationship is zest and energy. This is for connection within the therapeutic relationship, outside of the therapeutic relationship, having a sense of self-worth. So this is again explored within the therapeutic relationship and hopefully transferred outside of the room to help foster things like assertiveness, communication, a discerning of who is worthy of your vulnerability, that kind of stuff. Knowledge and clarity of yourself. So this is, you can see the how all of these are intertwined, of having a sense of self-worth can inform a sense of self, and vice versa. Understanding who you are, who other people are, and how to put boundaries or appropriate boundaries around relationships, have knowledge around how these relationships can and should function for you by virtue of, what you value and what you bring to relationships. Having a sense of creativity and productivity. Again, all of this starts in the room and is transferred out, and a desire for more connection without feeling. So again, you can hear kind of this dominant discourse that comes through of, when women are working to or desiring connection, it might be because they are helpless or they're needy, which is a label that has never been, maybe not never, we don't use definitives here, but much less frequently applied to men. So saying like, it is okay to have connection, and that doesn't mean I'm inherently not able to for myself, or that I am desperate or incomplete without this. So I wanted to also show you, because it does such a beautiful, concise job within like 2 minutes of talking about components of feminism, that I just wanted to share with you. Because I don't think I could do it this concisely, so I won't.
Most feminist counselors share these values and
And then
principles.
my apologies
Personal
for
is
this
political.
music doesn't
They
stop.
help create more awareness and promote critical thinking about how social structures can contribute to the problems that individuals and groups may be experiencing. Reconceptualize power. Feminist counselors identify the power imbalance between dominant and subordinate groups. Rename reality. They link people's private experiences with public issues. Create new methodologies. They look for effective ways to make change and end violence. Similar to other approaches, feminist counselors follow these basic counseling stages. Preparation. They ensure that their meeting space is private and comfortable. They also take time to think about the people they are about to see and how they can best meet their needs. Beginning, which includes introductions, joining an engagement, introducing confidentiality, and beginning to collaboratively set goals. Middle, choosing, contracting, and implementing agreed upon goals and intervention plans. Ending, evaluate the service user progress, establish future goals and support, and initiate closure. In contrast to mainstream approaches, feminist counselors apply values which can be labeled as distinctly feminist. Some of these are power sharing, making sure the counseling relationship is less intimidating by sharing power with the service user, valuing process as equal to product. The feminist approach emphasizes that the journey is just as important as the destination, ensuring informed consent. Feminist counselors demystify the counseling process and share pertinent information with service users. De-experting. Feminist counselors ensure that the service users, not the counselors, are viewed as experts in their own lives. Valuing service users. They seek out examples of service user strengths, capacities, and resilience in order to affirm and validate what people are capable of achieving, encouraging self-expression through art, music, stories, myths, narratives, and rituals.
Okay. That just gives like a role play of a therapist preparing for a client. All right. So I'll check in here. Any questions, comments about anything so far? All right, we'll keep rocking. So some of these were just covered in the video, but having with the therapeutic process, there is a real honoring of the client's expertise in their lived experience and just their the knowledge that they bring into the therapeutic relationship, where we really don't, where we're very aware of imposition or thinking at all that we know their experience better than they do, and also bringing in any sort of the understanding and the conversation around any sources of oppression. And that also means how the therapeutic process can be oppressive. Anything that happens outside of the therapeutic space also happens inside the therapeutic space, and understanding how do we achieve as egalitarian of a counseling relationship, recognizing that there's an inherent power differential by virtue of the roles that we have that in this relationship of therapist and client, but then also recognizing each of our social positions and how that plays a role in the work that we do. So again, that transcultural competence. So when you are in the process, you are developing an egalitarian relationship. Again, this is making some of the more covert messages, beliefs, all of that overt, and being willing to have a conversation about that. This could also potentially be where you share some of your limitations in how you may be able to understand a lived experience. And then that's all part of this informed consent as well of, do you want to work with me knowing these things about me? So feminism, or the feminist and multicultural approaches, really emphasize self-disclosure in that way. We'll talk a little bit more about other ways of self-disclosing. Again, exploring sources of marginalization and disconnection. This is, again, outside of the room as well as inside of the room. How are there moments where you're feeling disconnected from me? Can we repair that? Is this something that we can have a conversation about? Yes, Justine.
So I have a question concerning this model, since
Sure.
like I understand when you talk about transcultural, it's about kind of understanding and seeing on the other. So
Yes.
say you have a client who is more privileged than you and you are working within this theory. Is it your job to bring those issues up?
Yes. This is so recognizing kind of these like two layers, right? So in the role in this, the immediate role of U.S. therapist, you inherently hold power. However, your social position may be not in the power position, but because of your role as a therapist, this is something that you have the option of broaching. So I love this question too, because the case study today is a very privileged family. Does that answer your question, Justine?
Yeah, and I'm just I guess questioning more, if you get a privileged person who is not necessarily knowledgeable in
Sure.
these concepts,
Mm-hmm.
can you bring them up? Because I know a lot of the theories we worked before, it's like the client is the expert and we follow their subjective realities. But say you get a very misogynistic
Sure.
white man and you are working within this theory and somehow you end up together.
Yeah.
So how,
Yeah.
under this model, how would you kind of navigate that relationship?
Absolutely. So the thought behind this is that a feminist informed perspective is also beneficial to those who hold lots of privilege and power. So this is where you could use some of your discernment and asking kind of these very curious questions. Tell me a little bit about how how being a man affects your experience of this. How do you think your race plays a role in this? And you might get a client that goes, what? I don't see how that happens. And that might be something where it's just not something that the client leans into or that you ever really make movement toward that, but it also has to do with your assessment. So how you're conceptualizing this case is going to be informed by all of these aspects of the individual's identity, whether or not it's direct discussion that you have with your client. So there is some understanding of how to meet your client, right? So if you're sitting here really trying to heavily address these things that the client is really not understanding or they really disagree with, you're going to privilege the therapeutic alliance in that, in wanting to make sure that you're meeting the client where they're at. And it may be a matter of comfort, like it may just be a mismatch in terms of the approach. So you might find that your conceptualization is informed by this, but maybe some of the techniques or some of the conversation that you have is less heavily focused on things like social position. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Caitlin, did I see you flash across the screen again?
Yes, I will keep my card. I will stay. So I guess similarly to Justine's question, but maybe on a flip side is I think some of the things that I've learned in working with women specifically
Mhm.
is a level of their own internalized misogyny
Absolutely.
and not being able to have that conversation. And unlike working with the man in Justine's situation, I feel like you have to weigh that, right? Because I don't want it to be not a good fit, because I'm still working with women and I still think there's opportunity to provide them with healing and support. However, there is sometimes a limitation with a lot of the concepts, right? So like that they don't see it the way that I see it.
Absolutely.
And so kind of the opposite of Justine's example of like having a woman who's, you know, not privileged and also necessarily doesn't hold the same understanding of, you know, the patriarchy that I do.
Yeah. And that's one of like one of the potential critiques of this approach is that it can feel oppressive because if I have so you can see how this is, you know, politically more left leaning, right? Where it's like women's liberation and that kind of stuff. And that there are certain behaviors and characteristics that maybe come with a woman who is in that space. And that if I am trying to create an egalitarian relationship with my female client and make it, you know, in a heterosexual relationship with my female client and her male partner, am I doing her an injustice? Like, am I creating a issue within the relationship that wasn't an issue because I have a problem with that, because I think that egalitarian relationships are the best functioning relationships. So these are all things where you are so to me, your question, Caitlin, is inherently culturally competent because you're really investigating, what am I bringing? Do I have an agenda? Do I have things that I'm hoping to provide or insights that I'm hoping for my client to have? And how do I weigh that? How do I work within this framework that they have? Because that's we're towing a line in many ways here of, am I creating an issue that wasn't a part of the presenting issue? So this is where that collaboration comes in of, if this person, for example, is not saying like, I'm feeling oppressed within my relationship or within society, which we may know kind of objectively that this is an experience that happens. Not everybody is in that space of, because I don't even necessarily want to say awareness, because there's so many factors that inform our perception, that it would be, I think it's important to ask those questions. And I don't have like I wish I had a blanket formula for it, but it's, I just think it's a point well taken of recognizing that I have a perspective that I'm informed by, but I also have to be aware that what I'm doing is truly collaborative, and that I'm not pushing something that the client they don't want it, or it's just not something that's relevant to them. So I'll be honest, I always have a struggle kind of towing that line of recognizing what I'm bringing and how I'm approaching my client with that. Sarah.
Yeah, as you were talking about that, I do think it's important to recognize everything that you just talked about and that Caitlin brought up, because for some families and for some couples, right, that sort of relationship might not work for them. And what might be working for them might not resonate with our worldview, and that's okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'd be bringing in problems that they're not even interested in looking at because what they're doing is working for them.
Yeah. And the recognition that, maybe potentially at a later point, it could be something that it wants to be addressed, but making sure that you're staying in step with your client and where they're at right now. So I hope the message isn't like back away from these things. I think the message is like really read the room. Feel free to assess for some of these things. And if you're consistently getting messaging back from your client of like, that's not relevant, that's not relevant, that's not relevant, I would argue that privileging the therapeutic relationship and moving at their pace is more important than having more like social awareness. Yeah, Courtney.
I think it just also makes me think of like, the difference in how we're conceptualizing a case versus what we're necessarily saying.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
it's not the assumption that like by being a feminist, I'm going to say every woman needs to work, not and right, like that it's oppressive if you actively want to, right, do domestic work and right, be a stay-at-home parent. I think it's also just like, my brain automatically goes to narrative therapy, right? And like kind of gently guiding, like, where did you learn that? And
Absolutely.
not challenging if someone says, no, this is what I want. I don't want to be in an egalitarian relationship. Like I want this, right? Like exploring where it comes from rather than projecting like, this is what you need to be, just understanding that like who you are is okay. And also you can't take the content, like we can't take our societal structures, our cultures of origin, right? Like gender identity, sexual orientation, like we can't take it out of it. Like
Absolutely.
I think that we can still use the conceptualization and like the lens of, you know, like just feminist framework and,
Sure.
you know, multiculturalism and not project it or not force it in a way that feels inauthentic to the client.
Absolutely. And what you're speaking to is that multicultural competence of having a posture of curiosity. Like I'm not assuming that whatever is happening is not healthy or there's pathology behind that. I'm really just trying to understand how you came to believe this and what informs this, without challenging maybe directly. Those questions may be kind of challenging, right? Because maybe I've never been asked that before and I'm being pushed to think about something that I haven't thought about, but you're not asking them to change anything about it. You're just asking them to explore it. Yeah. Thank you, Courtney. Justine.
Yeah, I think going off the conversation we're having, a difficult part that could come up within therapy and that I've experienced because I work at a school-based district are when situations like suicidal ideation or DV come up, because then you're getting law enforcement involved. And that in itself can be a oppressive experience. So I'm wondering in those situations, for example, in DV, where the client is kind of questioning the methods of what is going on within this framework, how do you handle that? Because it's not something you can necessarily control, and you are an instrument of implementing those protocols.
I think that's one of the things that in one of the first slides is that psychotherapy can be inherently oppressive because of some of the systems that we're connected to and that we have to interact with, and how those systems are fundamentally unjust. I don't have an answer for how you do it because we have to also work within ethics and legal, right? Like, so if you're like, I hear you with this experience of DV, or I hear you in terms of having suicidal ideation, but like, I don't mess with this institution, so I'm not going to do that, you're liable. So there's limitations to what we are even like allowed to do or how we interact. And if anybody has any other thoughts, please feel free to jump in here. So I'm long-windedly, I'm saying, Justine, I don't know what you would do. Moni.
You know what, Justine, you bring up something interesting because I was thinking about it and I've had a lot of cases like this. Like for whatever reason, I'm like the designated DV person in the office where I work. So whenever there's like a really intense like sexual trauma or like DV case, it always reaches my hands. But I had a client for like, she was in and out of therapy for like 3 years. And I wouldn't say, I guess maybe I was doing something that was more feminist than I thought, you know? So I never conceptualized it this way, but I mean, really with her like experience of DV and just kind of like the things that were going on, the system really did do her dirty. Her children were removed. She was homeless. She had to live with the abuser, and in order to come out of that situation, you know, she had to go to the cops. We're able to coordinate housing for her far away in Newberry, far away from Chino, obviously. That's like really, really far away. And she was commuting back and forth to try to see her children and try to reunify with them. And it's just like, these systems aren't always very helpful. And like some piece of me was like, yeah, this is really terrible, but how much of it is also like, I don't want to, you know, she would ask me about about her relationship. She would go back and forth between the relationship with the perpetrator. But I think a lot of it was me trying to just kind of listen to her and hold space. Like, I know my supervisor fussed with me over the case a couple of times because he was just like, you just need to close that case because there's no way. I mean, if she's gonna keep going back, what's it matter? And I'm like, that's not what we do though. We hold space for them. We connect them to resources, even if they make a mistake. We're human. We do the same thing. It's hard to get away from a perpetrator. It's hard to make these things happen. And it takes time. It took her 3 years to eventually leave her perpetrator finally get her own housing. And this was a 3-year-long relationship doing counseling and therapy with her. So a lot of it was just kind of trying to be careful and guard against, pushing everything on her. But then also too, I don't know, that was a really interesting circumstance. It was really tough. And I think my thing too, that what came up for me also is I would always tell her too, I was like, I'm very aware that too, she was from Mexico. And the thing was, I was like, well, look, I'm going to be very transparent with you. What I'm telling you is very on brand for American culture. I've been Americanized because I'm born here. This might clash with what you've been taught. I don't want you to do anything that's not comfortable. But for me, to you, this is DV, and this is how it's defined. However, I want you to take that with a grain of salt and do what's best for you, whatever's the best decision for you.
Yeah, I really thank you so much, Moni, for sharing that. I think what you just said is very feminist and multiculturally informed of kind of showing up in your two different roles, right? So you're like, Moni, the person, here's my disclosure, here's my truth about this. In my position as a therapist, here's where I'm at. And that's very true to this approach. Do we, I see Justine and Erin that you have your hands raised. Do you guys want to take a quick break and then we'll come back to this discussion? Let's do that. So let's come back together at 3:12 and we'll start off with comments. Here. So getting back to the discussion, I don't know if Justine is here yet.
I'm here.
Okay, great. So yeah, I wanted to, Justine and Erin, I wanted to give you a chance to.
Yeah, I guess what I was just noticing that can be a strength and a weakness, I guess, for all the theories is that in a way, like we were talking about when presented with these concepts in a very direct manner, or if the client is not ready to hear it, it can be non-therapeutic. But at the same time, when I think of other theories and how we say they don't necessarily have this multicultural aspect, I'm also thinking though, in a way, those other theories blanketed with these more generalized concepts can still be explored in a multicultural way, if that makes sense.
100%. It's actually something we're going to talk about today in small groups. Yeah. It's beautiful because that's another, with feminism and multiculturalism, the thought is that there's merit to what we've created as a field so far, right? Yes, it is seated in patriarchy. It is informed by potentially an oppressive dominant discourse. At the same time, it doesn't mean they're worthless. They may just need to be amended, adapted, updated. And that's really what the feminist and multicultural critiques, I mean, that's not all they were saying, but that was one of the things that was stated is there's use in this. It just may not be relevant in the way that it's been presented or the way it's been conceptualized. So let's change that. Erin, did you, and I'm sorry, I sent you a message, but I want to make sure that I'm pronouncing your name right too. I know you said it the first week and.
Yeah, it's Erleen.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, something that I've struggled with, especially when it comes to being aware of systems that oppress certain communities, is staying in my ethical, especially when it comes to let's say discipline and corporal punishment, and knowing that, let's say this community is an undocumented Latino immigrant community, and I want to be able to give another opportunity, I guess, knowing their struggles and knowing that, you know, authority being involved in DCFS, and maybe there's a lack of understanding where the mother is just working to a couple more than one job and can't afford babysitting, so there's neglect and that's how they view it. Or even like DCFS or social worker already being involved with, we've heard this once about the father hitting the child or mother hitting child, and the first thing is called DCFS. And what I've tried to do is try to kind of take a step back and conceptualize, like, is this something that's been reoccurring, or can it be changed with teaching about discipline and how the system works, and given their barriers, how much worse it can be. But yeah, I feel like when let's say I'm bringing this up in supervision and they're just like, well, the mother's just not fit. So I don't know why you're trying to keep these children away from foster care if that's the better place, but what makes you think that that's where they should be, knowing the foster system is too. I think I find it very difficult to just have that boundary that I've constantly had difficulty with.
Absolutely. And I think you're also speaking to some of the like isomorphism that should be happening ideally in your supervisory relationship too, of, you know, being willing to ask that question that you just said of like, what informs you that this mother is unfit? You know, what is it about your worldview and your view of healthy, appropriate behavior informs what you're saying right now? So then it's kind of the opposite experience of that power differential, right? Of like, you come from a position of power in that therapist relationship, and then you're not in the position of power in your supervisee role. So what I'm hearing you say is, you know, this understanding of how, or at least a contemplation of navigating systems that we know do not, that can be and have proven to be unjust and not attending to the needs appropriately of the people that they claim to serve.
Yes.
Any comments or thoughts on that? I know I see something in the chat. All right, so I want to do one more thing before I let you loose and talk to one another, because I just feel like that would be really helpful to do. So in the spirit or to follow through with what I said, I do want to give you just a really quick clip of a definition and components of multicultural competence, so that we have a working like definition idea of that when we go into our small groups to have discussion. Oh, I'm gonna share my screen. Okay. So it's super quick clip here. Yeah, I just want to make sure that we're in the right spot. So this is Dr. Su defining what he believes is like the components of multicultural competence and what he looks for when he's training his students on this.
We've been talking a lot about training that. Just before we wind up, if someone gets some level of real mastery of, you know, multicultural competence, what does that look like? What is a master multicultural therapist look like?
The four things that I've said: self-awareness of yourself as a racial cultural being, awareness and understanding of the groups that you hope to work with, and understand that you understand their worldview, not that it's particularly that you buy into it, but you understand it. the ability to engage in a wide range of culturally appropriate intervention strategies that involve not only culture specific, but cultural universal helping strategies. And the fourth thing that we haven't talked about really is the systemic understanding about how systems affect the client and how your role as a helping professional, since you're employed by an organization or institution or working in private practice, how how you are influenced by that. Those are the things that I look for. And then the other thing I would say is that multicultural or cultural competence is not an end state. It is a constant, continual journey that people are making in terms of them. I'm still learning things from my LGBTQ brothers and sisters that I really, that amazes me sometimes. In terms of going up and talking, they indicate to me that I have a distorted view of what might be going on. And I always like to say that we will all commit blunders. We will all commit racial, gender, sexual orientation blunders. The importance is how you recover, not how you cover up. And I find beginning therapists and even established therapists, when they commit a blunder, get defensive and cover up, rather than what did I just do or say that came across that way. And those are things that I look for in terms of cultural competence.
Yeah.
All right. So I just wanted to give y'all a working definition. All right. So if it's okay with everybody, unless we have a consensus otherwise, I would like to facilitate some conversation between all of you. So I'll share my screen again so you can see my PowerPoint, but these are just there's several areas of reflection that I want to focus on here. So just making sure that we have, so as I mentioned before, every element of our training and our accumulation of knowledge and what we view as, academic and, appropriate in terms of how we accumulate knowledge. I'm just thinking of all of you have to write a dissertation. What do we ask you to do? Cite peer-reviewed articles. Is that the only way that you can gather knowledge? Absolutely not. Is that the standard that has been created for how we accumulate and disseminate knowledge? It is. Why is that? So what I want to do is, in groups of probably 3 or 4, I'm going to give you several cues here. So we have about 3 slides of questions that I want you to spend some time on. So I'm going to ask you to do slides 22 and 23 here together. So in terms of time, we can privilege the application of what we've been learning. So taking a look at all of the approaches that we've explored this semester and some of the constructs and concepts that are within structural, strategic, MRI, natural family systems, experiential, and contextual, looking at these and some of the components and techniques from a multicultural and feminist lens. What do you think can be adjusted and adapted and updated? I know this is one of the, in the worksheets, one of the areas where it talks about modifications for, I think it says diverse populations or something like that. But I just want to take a chance to apply what we're learning, because as I mentioned, multicultural and feminist, it's a way of thinking. It's a way of seeing the world in a larger way and acknowledging the injustices and bringing these systems and its impacts into the room. So that's one thing that I want to take some time to explore, and then looking at how we accumulate knowledge and how we are trained in this field. So just looking at, starting at research, how might our research be contributing to inequity? And you can talk about inequality as well. your education. So this is a chance to, take a take a critical look at how you've been learning, how we think about health as MFTs. How can we promote social equity and equality as MFTs? What do we get right as a field from a critical multicultural perspective? And then I'm wanting you to take some time to reflect on how you've been represented in your training in the therapy role. So yes, of course, in like your practicum and internship, when you're actually in the midst of training, naturally you are organically in that position. But like, what did you learn about, did you read about anything that represented you and like any of your identities in the role of the clinician? And I also want to make sure that that question makes sense. That last one. Is anybody unclear about that question?
Can you so are you saying, what have I learned for a particular group that I identify with?
Yes.
Is that what you're
Yeah.
And how that impacts my role as a clinician?
Absolutely. Or like when in your like readings or teachings has somebody who you relate to, had they been represented in the role of the therapist?
Okay.
So
Can we also apply that to like even role of a researcher?
absolutely. Of course, every teacher, researcher, therapist, all of the roles that you can occupy, when have you, like, how has it been for you in terms of representation? All right, so I'm going to create some breakout rooms here. Let's go ahead and take the rest of this hour. And then we'll reflect a little bit as a large group, because that's a lot of questions that I just posed to all of you. So yeah, let's take until like 4:50 or 3:55. We'll come back together, check in, and then take a break. All right. I'll see y'all in a little bit. I'll be popping in and out of rooms too.